Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, so buckle up, everybody, because today we're diving deep into the fascinating world of President Jimmy Carter and specifically his foreign policy. Yeah, we're talking about a president who really wanted to shake things up on the global stage. Our guide for this deep dive is a really insightful history podcast episode, and we've got a big mission ahead of us. We're going to try to figure out, was Carter's foreign policy a success, a failure, or maybe somewhere in between? And, even more importantly, can a president really put human rights first when the world is like this giant chessboard full of dictators and threats?
It's such a good question. And to really understand Carter's ambition, you have to remember the context. For decades, the U.S. had been playing this Cold War game where they often supported, shall we say, less than democratic regimes, all to keep communism in check.
It's kind of mind-boggling, right? Like supporting dictators to fight an ideology that's supposed to be about equality, but that was the reality of the Cold War. And then Carter comes in, throws out the playbook and says, nope, human rights are the priority. Was he naive? Or was he like a visionary way ahead of his time?
Well, I think that tension between idealism and realpolitik, that's at the heart of Carter's story.
Mm-hmm.
And, nowhere is that tension more evident than in the Iranian Revolution of 1979. This wasn't just some far-off event. It, shook the Middle East and really tested Carter's entire approach.
Okay, so just to set the scene a bit, the Shah of Iran, who was a U.S. ally despite his, let's just say, iron fist style of ruling, gets overthrown. The U.S. had been backing him for years because, well, Iran was strategically vital.
Yeah.
Oil, keeping the Soviets at bay, the whole 9 yards.
Exactly. The Shah was seen as this crucial pawn in the Cold War chess game.
Mm-hmm.
But within Iran, deeply unpopular. And that's where the revolution explodes onto the scene.
So in January 79, the Shah flees. Then comes Ayatollah Khomeini, returning from exile, establishing the Islamic Republic hostile to the U.S. right from the start. And things escalate fast. Students storm the U.S. Embassy and take 52 Americans hostage. It's this crisis that drags on for 444 days and really defines Carter's presidency.
And it becomes this agonizing symbol of his struggle to balance those grand ideals with the brutal reality of global events. On one hand, he wants to uphold human rights, avoid military action. On the other hand, you've got American citizens held captive by this hostile regime. Every move he makes has these huge potential repercussions.
Talk about pressure. 444 days. The families of the hostages, the world watching. Carter tries diplomacy, even a daring rescue mission Operation Eagle Claw. But it ends tragically. Helicopters malfunction. 8 U.S. servicemen die. It really makes you realize how intensely personal foreign policy can become.
It's such a stark illustration of those grand pronouncements about human rights meeting this messy, unpredictable world.
Yeah.
Some historians even argue that Carter's initial hesitation to fully back the Shah actually fueled the revolution.
Yeah.
It stoked that anti-American fire.
Wow, that's a thought, isn't it? So by trying to distance himself from the Shah's oppressive tactics, Carter might have inadvertently helped create the very situation he was trying to avoid. It's a tangled web for sure.
And it gets even more tangled when we bring in the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in December of 1979. This wasn't some border skirmish. This was the Soviets making a power play, stomping into a region uncomfortably close to U.S. allies. Alarm bells are ringing everywhere.
Yeah, this is a huge escalation in the Cold War, right? Suddenly, it's not just about ideologies, it's about vital oil supplies, Soviet expansionism, the whole global balance of power shifting. So how does Carter, Mr. Human Rights, respond to this blatant act of aggression?
Decisively. And it takes a lot of people by surprise. He condemns the invasion, slaps sanctions on the Soviets, even spearheads a boycott of the 1980 Moscow Olympics. And then there's the secret move, arming the Afghan Mujahideen through Operation Cyclone. Carter, despite his ideals, he shows that he's willing to play hardball.
Wow. So he's not afraid to get his hands dirty when he feels like it's absolutely necessary. And some historians actually see this as one of his most successful moves, showing strength, uniting the West against the Soviets, even contributing to the eventual collapse of the Soviet Empire.
That's one interpretation, the revisionist view. But remember, history is rarely a simple story. There's a twist.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Those Mujahideen that the U.S. was supporting, a move that seemed like a victory at the time. Well, post-revisionist historians point out that it might have helped push back the Soviets, but it also had some serious unintended consequences.
We're talking ripple effects that shape global politics for decades. It's almost textbook law of unintended consequences. Think about it. The U.S. supporting the Mujahideen, even covertly, ends up helping groups like the Taliban and al-Qaeda rise to power, groups that would later turn their attention towards the U.S.
It's a chilling thought, isn't it? Like, could Carter have possibly foreseen the long-term impact of that decision? It really makes you question the whole idea of good intentions in foreign policy, especially when you're dealing with these complex, volatile situations.
Absolutely. It's a question that historians continue to debate, and it speaks to the inherent difficulty of predicting the future in the world of international politics. What might seem like a tactical victory in the moment can have repercussions that echo for generations.
So we've got Carter, this fascinating mix of idealism and pragmatism. He's championing human rights, but also taking tough actions when he deems it necessary. And it's all happening against the backdrop of the Cold War, this constant tension, the threat of nuclear annihilation, always looming.
High stakes indeed. And that context is crucial for understanding Carter's decisions. He wasn't operating in a vacuum. He was navigating a world on the brink, trying to balance his vision with the stark realities of the Cold War.
Right, the pressure must have been immense. So let's shift gears a bit and look at Carter's overall foreign policy record. Was it ultimately a success or a failure? It seems like there's no easy answer.
There rarely is with history.
Yeah.
And that's what makes it so captivating, right? It's not just about dates and facts. It's about interpretation, debate, grappling with those shades of gray.
Okay, so let's break it down. On the success side, we've got his groundbreaking focus on human rights, like putting it front and center in global diplomacy. And then there's the Camp David Accords bringing Egypt and Israel to the peace table. That was a monumental achievement.
A diplomatic masterpiece. Carter's commitment to diplomacy and his ability to bridge these seemingly insurmountable divides is evident there. The Camp David Accords are a testament to his belief in the power of dialogue, even in the most intractable conflicts.
So human rights, Camp David. But what about the other side of the coin? The setbacks, the failures, where do we even begin?
Well, the Iranian hostage crisis casts a long shadow. It's a blow to U.S. credibility on the world stage and tarnished Carter's image, no question. The inability to secure the hostages' release before the end of his term is a major political wound.
And there are those inconsistencies in his human rights stance, too. You know, he continues to support some authoritarian regimes when it suits U.S. interests. It seems like sometimes those decisions were made with the Cold War looming in the background. It's easy to judge in hindsight, but you have to consider the context, the pressure he was under.
Absolutely. And remember, Carter's presidency unfolded during a period of immense global upheaval. The Cold War was entering a new phase. There were revolutions and uprisings happening all over the world. And the global economy was undergoing these massive transformations.
Talk about a turbulent time to be at the helm. Carter's trying to navigate all of that while staying true to his core principles. It makes you wonder how his foreign policy legacy has been viewed over time. I mean, right after his presidency, there was a lot of criticism, that he was too weak, too idealistic.
The Iran hostage crisis played a big part in that. It really hurt his image and gave this impression that his foreign policy approach had failed.
But in recent years, there seems to be a growing appreciation for some of his accomplishments, particularly his focus on human rights and his efforts to bring peace to the Middle East.
Historians are starting to recognize the long-term impact of his policies, even if they didn't always yield immediate results.
I like with the Camp David Accords, which really paved the way for future peace negotiations in the region. And his focus on human rights shifted the global conversation in a significant way.
It inspired a generation of activists and policymakers who are still working to create a more just and equitable world. It's a legacy that continues to ripple outward.
So his legacy is complicated. Successes and failures, idealism and pragmatism, it's all intertwined. But one thing's for sure, Carter was a president who wasn't afraid to try doing things differently.
He was determined to bring this moral dimension to U.S. foreign policy. And that's something that continues to resonate today, even decades later.
It definitely makes you think about the challenges facing the world today, doesn't it? Even though the Cold War is over, so many of the themes we've been talking about are still relevant.
Absolutely. The tension between idealism and pragmatism, balancing values with interests, those unintended consequences, these are timeless dilemmas in foreign policy.
And we see them play out in current events all the time. The debates over U.S. intervention in different conflicts, promoting democracy and human rights, figuring out how to deal with authoritarian regimes. It's like we're still grappling with the same fundamental questions.
The world has changed a lot since Carter's presidency, no doubt. But many of those core challenges in foreign policy remain remarkably consistent.
That's what makes studying history so valuable. It helps us make sense of the present and make more informed decisions about the future.
Absolutely. He wasn't steeped in that Cold War mindset that had dominated Washington for so long. He brought a different set of experiences and arguably a different set of values to the table.
And a strong moral compass, too. Carter was a devout Christian, and his faith clearly informed his worldview and his leadership style. It's easy to see how that translates into his emphasis on human rights.
That belief that America has a responsibility to champion freedom and democracy around the world. But as we've seen, those ideals often clashed with the realities of global power dynamics.
Right, and it's not like he was always perfectly consistent with those human rights principles either. We talked about his support for certain authoritarian regimes, and it seems like sometimes those decisions were made with the Cold War looming in the background. It's easy to judge in hindsight, but you have to consider the context, the pressure he was under.
Absolutely. And remember, Carter's presidency unfolded during a period of immense global upheaval. The Cold War was entering a new phase. There were revolutions and uprisings happening all over the world. And the global economy was undergoing these massive transformations.
Talk about a turbulent time to be at the helm. Carter's trying to navigate all of that while staying true to his core principles. It makes you wonder how his foreign policy legacy has been viewed over time. I mean, right after his presidency, there was a lot of criticism that he was too weak, too idealistic.
Yeah, the Iran hostage crisis played a big part in that. It really hurt his image and gave this impression that his foreign policy approach had failed.
But in recent years, there seems to be a growing appreciation for some of his accomplishments, particularly his focus on human rights and his efforts to bring peace to the Middle East.
I think historians are starting to recognize the long-term impact of his policies, even if they didn't always yield immediate results.
Like with the Camp David Accords. They really paved the way for future peace negotiations in the region. And his focus on human rights shifted the global conversation in a significant way.
It inspired a generation of activists and policymakers who are still working to create a more just and equitable world. It's a legacy that continues to ripple outward.
So his legacy is complicated. Successes and failures, idealism and pragmatism, it's all intertwined. But one thing's for sure, Carter was a president who wasn't afraid to try doing things differently.
He was determined to bring this moral dimension to U.S. foreign policy. And that's something that continues to resonate today, even decades later.
It definitely makes you think about the challenges facing the world today, doesn't it? Even though the Cold War is over, so many of the themes we've been talking about are still relevant.
Absolutely. The tension between idealism and pragmatism, balancing values with interests, those unintended consequences. These are timeless dilemmas in foreign policy.
And we see them play out in current events all the time. The debates over U.S. intervention in different conflicts, promoting democracy and human rights, figuring out how to deal with authoritarian regimes. We're still grappling with the same fundamental questions.
The world has changed a lot since Carter's presidency, no doubt. But many of those core challenges in foreign policy remain remarkably consistent.
That's what makes studying history so valuable. It helps us make sense of the present and make more informed decisions about the future.
By examining the past, we can gain insights into the present and maybe even avoid repeating the same mistakes.
One of the things that strikes me about Carter's foreign policy is how it reflects the tensions and contradictions of his era.
He was trying to bridge that gap between the Cold War mentality and a growing global awareness of the importance of human rights. He wanted to balance American power with a genuine desire for a more just and peaceful world.
And it's not like he had a clear roadmap either. The world was changing rapidly, and those old rules of the game were becoming increasingly irrelevant.
That's something we can relate to today, isn't it? We're facing a world that's more interconnected and unpredictable than ever, and it's full of its own unique set of challenges.
Carter's story is a reminder that there are no simple solutions in foreign policy, no easy answers.
It's a realm of messy compromises, tough choices, and those ever-present unintended consequences. Leaders need wisdom to understand the nuances and courage to make difficult decisions, even when they're unpopular.
Wisdom to grasp the complexities of the situation, and courage to make those tough calls even when they go against the grain.
And it's a reminder that even the best intentions can go awry. We need to approach foreign policy with a degree of humility, recognizing that we don't always have all the answers and that our actions can have far-reaching effects.
We need to be constantly learning, adapting, and striving to make better choices.
Something that often gets overlooked in these discussions is the role of public opinion.
Oh, that's a great point. Public opinion can make or break a president's ability to conduct foreign policy effectively.
Absolutely. And in Carter's case, he was dealing with a public that was still deeply scarred by the Vietnam War. There was a lot of anxiety about getting entangled in foreign conflicts.
There was a strong isolationist sentiment at the time. People were skeptical of U.S. intervention abroad.
It must have been incredibly difficult for him to push for a more active foreign policy, even when he felt it was necessary.
He was walking a tightrope, trying to balance his own vision with the expectations and concerns of the American people. It's a challenge every president faces. But for Carter, given the historical context, it was especially acute.
He came into office promising a more ethical, more humane foreign policy. But he also had to deal with a dangerous world and a public that was wary of getting involved in foreign conflicts.
It was a tough balancing act, and it highlights how foreign policy isn't just about what happens behind closed doors in Washington. It's about shaping public opinion and building support for the president's actions.
And that requires effective communication, clear objectives, and a willingness to explain those tough decisions to the public.
It also requires transparency and accountability. People need to feel like they understand what their government is doing in the world and why.
They need to feel like their voices are heard. Which brings us back to that central question of how we approach foreign policy in the 21st century.
How do we balance our values and our interests in a world that's so interconnected and complex? How do we create a foreign policy that's both ethical and effective? And how do we get the public on board?
These are big questions, and there are no easy answers. But I think Carter's story offers some valuable insights. He shows us the importance of idealism, tempered with pragmatism, the power of diplomacy, but also the need for military strength when necessary.
He emphasizes the importance of human rights, but also the challenges of promoting those rights in a world where power often trumps principle. And he demonstrates how crucial it is for leaders to communicate openly and honestly with their citizens.
It's a complex legacy, no doubt, full of contradictions and nuances.
But it's a legacy worth studying and reflecting on as we face the foreign policy challenges of our own time.
And maybe by learning from both Carter's successes and his missteps, we can find a way to build a more just and peaceful world.
A world where human rights are truly respected, where diplomacy triumphs over conflict, and where the United States plays a constructive and responsible role on the global stage. That's a goal worth striving for.
It's amazing when you think about it. I mean, as we've been talking about Carter's foreign policy, the world has changed so much since his time, it's almost mind-blowing.
It really is, like stepping into a different universe. The Cold Wars over globalization has reshaped everything, and we've got these new threats like terrorism and climate change front and center. You'd think foreign policy would be a completely different ballgame now.
Yeah, you'd think so. But some things never really change, do they? I mean, those fundamental challenges of foreign policy, balancing values and interests, trying to predict consequences, the whole constant need to build and maintain alliances, they're like those classic dilemmas that never go out of style.
I like that. It's like those fashion trends that keep circling back. Some things are just timeless, even in international relations, I guess. But you know what really strikes me? It's not just about what happens in, those hallowed halls of power. We as everyday citizens, we're part of this equation too. We can't just sit back and leave foreign policy to the so-called experts.
Absolutely. It's easy to think of foreign policy as something distant, like something happening over there. But it affects our lives in so many ways. Just think about it. The economy, our security, even the environment.
Yeah.
All connected to what's happening on the global stage.
Yeah, it's like those domino effects you see in those old movies. One piece falls and the whole structure starts to crumble. We have a responsibility to stay informed, to engage in these discussions, and to hold our leaders accountable for the choices they make.
Exactly. We're not just spectators. We're participants in shaping our nation's role in the world. And, one of the biggest takeaways from Carter's experience is that there's no such thing as a flawless, perfect foreign policy.
Right. It's like trying to solve a Rubik's Cube blindfolded. You might get a few sides right, but there are always going to be some messy parts left over. There are always compromises, trade-offs, those unintended consequences lurking around every corner.
Exactly. The goal isn't to find that elusive, perfect solution. Because honestly, it doesn't exist. It's about striving for a foreign policy that reflects our values, one that's strategic and effective, and that takes into account the long-term impact of our actions.
So it's like playing chess, not checkers, thinking several moves ahead, anticipating those ripple effects. And it demands a willingness to learn from our mistakes, to adapt when the world throws us a curveball, and to constantly reevaluate what truly matters.
Well said. We need to approach foreign policy with a healthy dose of humility. We don't have all the answers. And we can't control every outcome. It's about recognizing the limits of our knowledge and our ability to influence events.
It's about being open to different perspectives too, right? Listening to those voices from all corners of the world, not just the ones that echo our own, preconceived notions.
Studying history often gives me a sense of hope. It reminds us that progress, however messy and uneven, is possible. Just think about the strides we've made in human rights, democracy, global cooperation over the past century. It's really remarkable.
It really is. And it wasn't just luck or coincidence either. Those advances were hard-won, the result of countless individuals and organizations fighting for a better world.
People who are willing to put in the work, the dedication, often at great personal risk. That's inspiring, isn't it?
It really is. And it's a reminder that even in the face of these daunting challenges, we have the power to make a difference, whether it's through our own actions, supporting organizations that are fighting for peace and justice, or simply staying informed and engaged. We're all part of this story.
And that's a legacy we can all be proud of, contributing to a world where human rights matter, where diplomacy triumphs over conflict, and where America plays a positive role on the global stage.
Beautifully said. Well, I think that about wraps up our deep dive into President Carter's foreign policy. A journey through complexity, contradictions, and the enduring challenges of navigating the world stage.
It's been a fascinating conversation. Carter, despite his setbacks, really tried to change the way America interacted with the world. His story offers valuable lessons, reminding us of the delicate balance between idealism and pragmatism, and the profound impact of decisions made in the Oval Office.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. We hope it sparked your curiosity and given you some food for thought. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking those tough questions, and keep striving for a better world.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.